wir hören jetzt die Sicht eines Unternehmens, das ganz viel tatsächlich Natur verbraucht, um Rohstoffe zu gewinnen und fragen, wie kann ein solches Unternehmen sich mit Biodiversität und Lieferketten und Berichterstattungspflichten auseinandersetzen. Wir reden von Heidelberg Materials, die bis vor einigen Tagen tatsächlich noch Heidelberg Zement hießen, so werden die meisten das kennen. Und Heidelberg Zement hat vor 6 Jahren schon eine Ökologin eingestellt, die sich für eine englische NGO, also eine englische Nichtregierungsorganisation gearbeitet hat und die von sich sagt, ich bin passionate about insects, also eine Insektenliebhaberin und die aber irgendwann sagte, ich will die Seiten wechseln, nicht immer von NGO-Seite aus kritisieren, was die Wirtschaft anrichtet, sondern innerhalb eines Unternehmens das Maximum an Biodiversitätsschutz rauszuholen. Und das tut sie jetzt seit 4 Jahren für Heidelberg Materials, Dr. Carolyn Jewell. Und bevor sie startet, muss ich Ihnen sagen, Carolyn Jewell wird auf Englisch referieren. Und Carolyn, we ask you, we are all not native speakers, so please don't hurry and give us a chance to follow your speech. Carolyn Jewell,
Certainly.
over to you.
Thank you very much, Tanya, and thank you so much for inviting myself and Heidelberg Materials to present today at the Digital Dialogue. Also, thank you so much for your patience in allowing me to speak English. This would have been near on impossible for me to do in German, so thank you very much. So what I will talk to you today is a bit of an introduction to Heidelberg Materials, if you're not so familiar, and then what we're doing on biodiversity, and then moving on how this is supporting us with this crazy new world that we're entering with all these directives and regulations and initiatives that are starting. And then how can we face this challenge going forward together? So Heidelberg Materials, as was Heidelberg Cement just last week, we're one of the world's largest building material companies. And what this means from a biodiversity perspective is that we interact with so many different habitats and species around the world. We have over 3,000 locations, whether that be quarries or industrial sites, for example, concrete plants, with a wide spread across 5 continents. So you can really imagine that how we interact with nature is a very complex topic. So how are we managing this? We have a number of tools in our toolbox that we use to help us understand, firstly, what our impacts are on biodiversity, both negative and positive, but also how we depend on it, how we come across it in our everyday operations. And I think key to this is having a biodiversity policy, which really sets out how we're going to manage biodiversity, what we're expecting from our company in terms of outputs and responsibilities. And underlying this policy, we have a number of key principles, 10 key principles. And these actually very nicely match the restoration principles sitting under the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration. So it's about how we interact and how we're responsible for the land that we manage during our land management phase. It's very important that we have sustainability commitments, and I will come back to these because these really have set us up nicely to deal with some of these changes that are happening in the reporting arena. I think it's really important, and today is a good example, that we're very interactive when it comes to business and biodiversity knowledge exchange. I think it's so important that companies have the opportunity to share best practice, interact with other stakeholders, whether they be NGO or decision makers, and I think that's a key part of what we do. In-house expertise in advisory material, and I'll come back to this of how the atmosphere has changed a little bit in terms of the business and biodiversity world, but it's very important that our operations are supported with key information on how they can manage nature in their quarries. Invasive alien species, we're the type of business that creates bare ground, which can be very quickly colonized by invasives. So it's a very pertinent topic for us. It's really important to engage the workforce. the focus is particularly on quarries because that's where our big impact is. But I think in terms of halting biodiversity loss, engaging the whole workforce is what we need to do. So we have targeted campaigns on different topics. For example, a couple of years ago, pollinators, and we supported the operations with targeted information, but we also targeted headquarter staff. What can you do in your garden to support pollinators? Understanding our risk and how to minimize this is a key part. So we do regular biodiversity risk assessments. And where there's a highlighted risk, we implement biodiversity management plans. Again, I'll come back to this as how this has set us up ahead of these new requirements. And lastly, partnerships. We're an extraction company. The vast majority of our workforce are mining engineers and do not have expertise in nature. And this is where partnerships are so crucial to bring in that external expertise and boost our own resources and our own knowledge to allow us to manage biodiversity in a responsible way in our sites. So that's where we are at the moment. So I've been working in the business and biodiversity area for well over a decade, a long time, and both as part in my role in an NGO, but also in my role in Heidelberg Cement. We've done a lot of lobbying about the business contribution to reversing biodiversity loss. And I think this was really nicely summed up by this quote, that it's not just for governments and international and non-government organizations, but the private sector can play a really big role in this sort of halt and reverse. And so I went off on maternity leave in 2020, thinking, right, you know, we're getting there. It's a good place. COP15 was just around the corner. And I think we were all in the business and biodiversity world quite excited about what the future looked like in terms of the private sector's contribution. I came back from maternity leave and wow, this is what we were doing in Heidelberg Materials. A huge amount had happened in a very short amount of time, which led to brains blowing, panic, tears, confusion. Oh my goodness, how on earth were we going to respond to everything that had happened in such a short space of time? So what exactly had happened? This. Crazy. So at a European level, we were talking about EU taxonomy, the corporate sustainability due diligence had come through. We have the CSR directive, we have the water directive, a new biodiversity strategy. We now also have the EU restoration law, which is being proposed. And overarching all of these, we had two key projects, the Align project and the Transparent project. And these are all looking about having to harmonize ways in which we understand and measure natural capital, with Align being particularly focused on biodiversity. But that was not all. At international level, we have the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosure. We're still waiting for COP15, which fingers crossed will be in December and we'll have no more changes. There's now the Science-Based Targets for Nature. GRI are now updating their biodiversity standard, and we have ISSB. So it really has exploded. And now over all of this, we now have this concept nature positive, which is seen to be the net zero equivalent for biodiversity. But how on earth do we respond to all this? What does all this actually mean? So at Heidelberg Cement, we feel we're in quite a good place with biodiversity because we have been doing a lot over the past 10-15 years. And I think the key thing that's arising out of all these initiatives, whether they be European or internationally based, is that it's all about location, location, location. And biodiversity is very rapidly following the climate footsteps. So what we see for climate is rapidly turning into what we see for biodiversity, with the big difference about location. The impact on biodiversity is very locally relevant. And so I think that the first thing that we looked at was, well, we do actually understand our footprint. And we do this in a couple of ways. Firstly, there's the Integrated Biodiversity Assessment Tool, IBAT, and we've been subscribing to this since 2011, every 3 to 4 years. So we have a very good understanding of where our sites are located, and if they are located near high biodiversity values, so whether they be protected areas or key biodiversity areas, we already have the good understanding on this. And we have a sustainability commitment that where we are within 1 kilometre, we will implement biodiversity management plans. And secondly, we also are undertaking net impact assessments at the ecosystem level at all of our active quarries. So therefore, that really helps us understand also the impact. So what habitats existed at the site before we started or are surrounding the site now? And then looking at the positive contribution through our reclamation plans 20, 30, 40 years down the line when the quarries are exhausted. We also have a biodiversity policy already in place in terms of a governance and structure concept. We already have that, so that's good. And we're also working more on the governance. So we now have a Chief Sustainability Officer, and all the ESG topics are very much covered off by the board, which is really good. And I think this is something which has definitely increased in the business world. It's great to see how many CEOs and CSOs are talking about biodiversity at conferences, and you never used to see that previously. So that's really good. We also understand our material topics. I think for our sector, it's quite easy because we directly impact the land. We know that we can change ecosystems, we can have an impact. We know that we can impact water, particularly fresh water. And we also know, as pointed out already, that invasive alien species are a key topic for us, and we take that on board. And lastly, there's partnership support, and I cannot emphasize the importance of this. Our partners are being a key part of helping us get armed for what's happening, supporting us in understanding what's happening at the policy level, and that has been incredibly useful. However, we still have a lot of challenges, as I'm sure you're all very familiar with. So our business is an old business, and we work across many legislative frameworks. So many of our quarries got their permits decades ago, before EIAs were ever thought of. So first of all, ticking the box for EIAs for EU taxonomy can be quite difficult, because there are still some countries that don't mandate this, and getting that information is important. We have a good understanding of the ecosystems that we interact, but species and genes, that brings in a whole level of complexity. Through IBAT, we can get information on the ranges of the IUCN red listed species that interact with our quarry, but finer level detail can be very difficult to get, as incredibly onerous. But we're starting to look at new techniques to support us. So we have a pilot project looking at eDNA. We've also just had a project through our Quarry Life Award looking at ecoacoustics as a new way of monitoring species living in our quarries. The EU taxonomy is focused on plant sites, which seems crazy because our impact is at quarry level, but at the moment this is at plant sites, although we already started on this before the EU taxonomy. So even our plant sites that are located near high biodiversity value areas need biodiversity management plans. The interpretation is just mind-blowing. There are so many different definitions. The criteria is unclear. We're working with the auditors. They don't have clarity. We don't have clarity. It's kind of trying to support each other along the journey to understand exactly what's needed. And I think this is going to make it almost impossible to be able to compare the results of different companies because of this big level of interpretation. The synergy of the different schemes, to be able to have to report to one and then the other with different information is frustrating. It's hard work getting the different information. We really need one system that fits everything, which then simplifies this topic internally instead of asking for so many different KPIs. We're very aware of our direct operations. We have a very good handle on what's happening with that, but our value chain is a different matter. And that's going to be very challenging, as it is to all other companies, particularly companies that are really based on the supply chain. I think this is going to be very difficult to get the information from. IT challenges to actually get this data. A lot of this data hasn't been, a lot of it hasn't even been digitalized. We still have reclamation plans and environmental impact assessments that are all documents filed away in filing cabinets. So getting this digitalized and getting an IT system that works across all our business lines. We have very different business lines, very different products. So bringing this together is a big challenge. Again, lack of comparability even within sectors. Is some of this information even meaningful if you can't compare within sectors? And one thing that I'm very aware of, before I went on maternity leave, my job was to support our operations in knowing how to create good ponds, how to protect St. Martin's nesting in the quarries. It was very much focused on actions for biodiversity. Since I've come back, vast majority of my time is spent on webinars, understanding all these initiatives. It's spent on working out how to do the reporting. And there is a big concern that so much time and effort is spent trying to understand all these initiatives that actually in the short term, biodiversity is hampered because we're not doing those projects, or at least we don't have the capacity to do so much projects now. And I think there has to be some common sense that we really need to do action now. Otherwise, by the time everybody has all their reporting sorted out, will we actually have any nature to protect? Big question. So I was asked to sort of pick up some recommendations on what I thought companies needed to get going with to be able to respond to some of these requests. And I think firstly, you need to work out what's material to you. Biodiversity is a very material topic to Heidelberg Cement and has been for quite some time. Understand where you are on your value chain are your biggest impacts. So for us, as a big land manager, the biggest impact is done by ourselves. So for us, that is the most important to get organized first. Prioritize your supply chain. I think the supply chain side of this is very, very, very difficult. And I do not envy companies that are working across big, complex supply chains, but I think the big thing is really to prioritize those that have the biggest impact on biodiversity and start with those. Understanding your footprint, like I said, location is all about it. What ecosystems are you interacting? Which are you impacting, whether that be positive or negative? Interrogate existing data sets. So we use IBAT, but I know that's a paid system. There's also free data sets available, for example, Global Safety Net and the UN Biodiversity Labs. There's a lot of information already out there that you can start with to get an understanding of your impact. Develop a company policy. This is a great way of starting to mainstream, and this kind of integrate with decision makers. I think it's really important that this topic is not just an ESG topic in a small department. At Heidelberg Cement, it's now in our treasury, it's now in our risk management, it's now in our finance sector, it's in the board. So we're really sort of mainstreaming this topic through so that people start to think about it whenever we have a new project or we're working up new reporting mechanisms. Set strategic targets. So I know we have the science-based targets for nature that we're still waiting for, but I think it's really important as a way of, I think, creating a concentrating your mind on, again, what's the most material topic, and how can you start to get a handle on how to minimize your impacts, and also for understanding your dependencies. And lastly, I think it's really important to engage with policymakers. So this is what we've been doing, particularly with the EU taxonomy. At the moment, this is focused just on our cement production facilities, so our cement plants, but actually our quarries can also help in a positive way. So we're trying to work in to see whether we can get some of our reclamation to nature EU taxonomy aligned. And also in terms of the EU restoration law, this is a particularly exciting place where we've been doing a lot of interaction with the Commission to also say how industry can have this really, really big positive impact on biodiversity as well. So all in all, I think that the new directives are really good. They're going in the right direction. I think we needed them. We need to recognise the part that business plays, but at the end of the day, we still need to do a lot of good actions on the ground to support biodiversity. And I think the policymakers should just be aware of benefit versus effort versus actual. Does it really help? Is it really minimizing greenwashing? Is it really supporting the good companies, or could there be another way to do it? So I hope that was useful, and thank you very much.